The creepiest encounter with a stranger that still gives you the creeps? Write in the comments what you think about this. Your story? Enjoy the show. Story 1. I think about this from time to time. I am a female, and it was 1981. I was 21 and driving alone from NorCal to Spokane, WA to visit my family. Up through Central Oregon on a long, isolated stretch of HWY 97, a man in a car started passing me, slowing down beside my car and trying to get me to roll my window down by waving and smiling. I kept driving. When I got to a small market, I pulled over at a phone booth. He stopped too. He said he wanted to buy me lunch. I shouted back from a distance I had to make a call. I called my mom and she was alarmed. She said give me his license plate number. I turned around to get it and I see him peeling out in the gravel traveling the direction that we had come from. At that time of my life, I looked like Ted Bundy's exact type, but I don't think Ted was still active in 1981. Story 2. When I was about 30, I stopped by the grocery store right after work at about 5:30 p.m. This was the winter, so it got dark earlier. I am shopping, but every time I turn the corner into a new aisle, I see this man staring at me but then back away, so of course my spidey sense kicks in. I get spooked and made a very stupid decision to leave the store by myself. This store had 2 exits, and I saw that as I went to the one exit he was heading for the other. I was parked immediately on the other side of the handicap stall directly in front of my exit, so I figured I could easily make it to my car. I was an avid runner at the time. I could see him coming my direction. I am almost to my car when a different man in a white van with no windows pulls up and asks me how to get to Joe's Crab Shack. I tell him quick directions, but the whole time I am looking behind me for the other guy. I turn around quickly to see him making signals at the other guy. He says he didn't hear my directions. Could I come closer? I looked at him as I am getting my car keys out and yelled at him, I already gave you directions, now go away. He ended up driving away. By this time, the other guy had bridged the gap. He is now in my face. I stand toe-to-toe with him, making myself as big as I can, telling him to leave me the fuck alone, my husband is expecting me at home, etc. I am yelling at him at the top of my lungs to draw attention from other people. He finally backs off and I get in my car and lock the door. Now I try to call the cops, but my phone would not dial, so they had obviously jammed it. I do not ever think I have been more terrified in my entire life. Now, knowing they have a big white van, I drive around for a while to make sure they do not follow me home. I get home safe and sound and call the non-emergency number to report this incident. I describe both men, the vehicle, and the fact that my phone was jammed. As I am sharing details, they, as if they can place me on hold as they have another call coming in. I am on hold for about 10 minutes. When the 311 operator comes back on the phone, they ask, "Can you describe the men again?" I asked why, and they said that the person they were talking to while I was on hold was another woman at the same location reporting the same behavior. To this day, I firmly believe that they were traffickers looking for an easy mark. I often wonder if they were ever caught. So yeah, crust my story about the time I was almost abducted. Story 3. I lived alone in a studio apartment in my 20s, first floor, urban area. A huge rhododendron bush obscured my front windows, so I didn't bother much with drawing the blinds. The windows had that feature that prevented them from being opened more than several inches, and I figured I was safe. One evening, I took a bath and, living alone, walked around the main room naked. I heard a sound, like a whisper or an exhalation, and saw a man's face at the window, watching me. I killed the lights, ran out of the room, and hid in my kitchenette for a long time. I kept the shade down on that window permanently after that. All I remember was that he wore glasses. I did not stop to get a good look. I never felt 100% comfortable in my apartment after that, and I feel angry about that. This was years ago, before social media, so I don't know if this had happened to others in the area. Story 4. In the 80s, I was a kid in the Kmart parking lot with my little brother. I was 10 at the time. He was 7. This man across the parking aisle from us kept opening his car door a little and putting his foot out. He then stepped out and held his dick in one hand and strummed his nuts with the other. My brother pointed it out. We began frantically locking all the doors. Then my mom came out. We told her about it. About a month later, I hurt my ankle and had to have surgery. I went into my doctor's office one day and there was a wanted poster of the same guy in a sketch, wanted for rape. He had long, stringy brown hair and a beard. I said, "Mom, that's him." She never called the police as she didn't want to put me through that. I don't know whatever happened to the case. It made me very vigilant and cautious of my surroundings. Mom never left us in the car again. Story 5. I was in a shitty part of Memphis walking down a street, and someone screamed at me from a darkened parking garage that someone had been stabbed, and they needed a phone to call 911. It was an empty street in the middle of the day. I looked into the garage, and this distraught guy was leaning around a pillar about 30 feet from me, motioning for me to come to him. I told him I'd call 911 and pulled out my phone. He yelled, "No, you gotta come here and help! She's gonna die, sir!" And I said, "Nah, I'm just gonna call the cops from the street so they can find us." His demeanor totally changed from frantically trying to get me to come into the garage into a casual, friendly attitude. He smiled and said, "Ah, okay, sir. You have a blessed day then." Then he stopped hiding behind the pillar and started walking towards a stairwell. He had a syringe in his hand. When he was almost at the stairwell, he started whistling a song. I booked it back to my car. Fuck Memphis. Story 6. Not necessarily creepy, but strange nonetheless. I was 13 years old, and my mom and I had stopped by the shops to get some milk, bread, etc. I was in my school uniform, and being the quiet, shy kid I was sticking close to my mom. We were walking in this shopping center, and there is a 55, 60-year-old male in smart casual clothes walking towards us, not acting strangely at all. I stepped to the side so we don't collide, and this man for some reason just punches me right in the face. My right cheek had a fist-shaped bruise on it for a week afterwards. My mom and I were so shocked that we both just stood there looking at each other in disbelief, and then I cried more from shock than pain. The guy disappeared immediately, and because that part of the center wasn't covered with CCTV, we never could find out what happened. Not necessarily creepy, but definitely weird. Story 7. I, 25F at the time, was on a swing set in my hometown. This guy, mid-early 20s, comes and sits on a swing beside me. We chat a bit. And after a while, he starts talking about how he is obsessed with serial killers, specifically the famous kind that target women. A lot about how the victims deserved it. I acted nice and eventually made an excuse that I had somewhere to be. As soon as I was out of sight, I sprinted, and I went to my mom's work a few blocks away. Less than a year later, I saw a news article that he had stabbed a few women. Story 8. My young daughter was at soccer practice. A middle-aged man with a dog was on the other side of the fence, just staring at them in a creepy way. I finally said, "Are you worried about bringing your dog in here with the kids playing soccer or something?" He didn't acknowledge me but crossed the street and continued to watch them. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore and yelled at him, "Are you looking for someone or something?" He said something under his breath and walked away. My mom instincts were going off like crazy. When we got home, I looked up that neighborhood on the Megan's Law website. Sure enough, registered sex offender who did 20 years in prison for some truly disgusting things. Trust your instincts, people. Story 9. Mid-afternoon, snowing and cold in a Canadian city, a quiet, yuppie neighborhood. I was walking home from a trip to the grocery store when I was approached by a young man. I stopped when he got close and he asked about the location of a hostel. I said I had no idea where the hostels were located, but thought most were downtown, indicated the direction he needed to go, apologized, and started walking. Within a few steps, I realized he was walking behind me as I could hear the snow squeaking. I increased my walking speed, as much as I could manage in 30-ish cm, of snow with a bag of groceries. He continued to follow. I started to become both concerned and slightly alarmed when I heard a loud, gruff voice yelling from behind my follower, "What the fuck are you doing? Why are you following her?" I glanced around to see my neighbor coming towards me and the guy. Story 10. I lived alone in my first apartment and had been living there for almost a year. I had recently gotten a new neighbor who seemed kind of sketchy, but he minded his own business, so I minded mine. One evening, all lights were out because I had no ceiling lights for some reason, and I was just on my bed kind of looking at the ceiling, not doing anything. All of a sudden, I start hearing some kind of commotion, but my neighbor often had male visitors over for pretty loud sex, so I thought he maybe just had a visitor. All of a sudden, I hear these footsteps that seem to come from inside my apartment, but since it's dark, I can't see, and since I had no ceiling light, I couldn't turn any on to see. The footsteps come closer, and it gets very apparent that they are in my apartment, and someone is kind of stumbling around trying to figure out where to walk in the dark. I start hearing the person touching the walls, flicking light switches to turn on the lights, and that's when I see the shadow of a person standing in the doorway into my room. I have never felt my body freeze like that before. Some stranger was in my apartment in the dark, walking around. I immediately thought he was going to find me and maybe hurt me, and so I started debating with myself if letting him know someone was home was just going to hurt myself even more or maybe scare him off. Out of nowhere, I just let out this pretty loud, "Hey!" and he freezes. I keep on going with, "What are you doing? Can you go out again?" And I spoke in a lower register I didn't know I could naturally speak in. He quickly starts apologizing and tries to turn around and find his way out in the dark and says, "Oh, I'm sorry. Didn't know anyone lived here," and proceeds to fumble out, to which I fucking reply, "Oh, that's okay. It's okay," in some weird attempt to still be friendly. When he gets out, I catch my breath, freak out on the inside, and run to the front door to find out it wasn't locks. I run back into my room and see these two shadows on my wall and hear men laughing. My neighbor spoke Russian, I think, but spoke in English now, and I couldn't completely make out what they said. But it sounded like the dude who was in my apartment was kind of nervous and confused, saying, "I didn't think anyone would be in there. You said no one was in there." To which my neighbor laughed, and they walked into his apartment. I start crying my eyes out because I was so prepared to get hurt in any kind of way, call my dad and freak out, and he freaked out on my behalf. And the next day, I contact my housing company. I tell them what happened, that yes, my door was unlocked, but that it sounded like my neighbor had sent his friend into my apartment, knowing I lived there. They reply and say sorry for the situation, but that they're very confused that I had a neighbor, since there's not supposed to live anyone in that apartment at that moment. Then I freak out about who the fuck this dude and all his friends are, and my housing company are just as confused, but decides to not figure out who he is or why he's there and kind of just let him stay there. I have never felt so unsafe in an apartment before or since, and every time I think of that evening, I shake and so many questions come to mind. Who was he? Why was he there? Why did he send his friend into my apartment? Had he himself been in my apartment before? WTF was going on? I moved around 6 months later, and every time someone knocks on my door, I keep thinking about him and what happened, and it sends chills down my spine, thinking about that he wasn't supposed to live, that he knew I sometimes forgot to lock the door, and if he'd ever, unknowingly to me, had been in my apartment. Ugh, hated that evening. Story 11. I was at a mall when I was 10 or 11 with my grandma, around 2008 or 2009. While my grandma was talking to a vendor, I walked away for a moment without her knowing to look at something nearby. I don't remember what it was. This weird guy approached me. He had to be in his 40s or 50s, somewhere around there. He said, "Hey," and being naive, I said hi back, not thinking much about it in the moment. I was wearing a t-shirt that said some sort of phrase in the graphic. He asked what my shirt said, so I read it to him. When I looked back up from my shirt to look at him, he was just completely staring at my chest, borderline drooling, and it grossed me out. He said something else while still looking down. I don't remember what he said, but I remember being freaked out. Suddenly, out of nowhere, my grandma came out from behind, grabbed my arm, and confronted the man. She began yelling at the man in Spanish, calling him a pervert and threatening to call the cops, which caused him to immediately run off. The memory stuck with me. I was so grossed out afterward. I was cringing for days whenever the thought came back. I still cringe when I think about it. I became so self-conscious of my chest after that experience that I didn't wear shirts with graphics or phrases for years out of fear that it would draw attention from creeps. Story 12. I was about 17, riding my bike home alone from a friend's place in summertime just after the sun dipped. I stopped at a gas station for a drink, put my bike on a fence, and started walking up to the door. A guy walked up to me. He was maybe in his early 20s, sandy blonde hair, good-looking. I figured he was from out of town and needed directions. He asked me some questions like, did I grow up here, do I live nearby, etc. His smile was nice, but his eyes looked oddly cold and mean. I could sense something was off about him, and I remember getting a prickly feeling on my neck. Then he asked me if I want to get in his car and go for a ride with him. When he asked this, I kind of froze, surprised by it, and also becoming overwhelmed by the feeling that I might be in danger. He tried to coax me, and then he took a couple steps towards me, and my body had an immediate flight reaction. Without any thought, I ran to my bike and started my way back home at full speed. That was almost 18 years ago, but I still remember it vividly. I'm certain that things were just moments away from going sideways. Story 13. When I was living at home, my parents used to volunteer to a bunch of different organizations because they didn't work and wanted to socialize with others. Around when I was in middle school, my parents volunteered for a wine fest at the Neptune Festival in VA Beach. My sister and I went with them, but we walked around on the boardwalk while they were busy. I didn't have a phone at the time, but my sister did. This is important for later. We got tired of walking and sat down on a bench that was near the front of the big Neptune statue. A way older man came near us and started to talk to us. My parents immersed us around a bunch of older people at that age, just because she believed it helped us build connections when we joined the workforce. So talking to an older adult wasn't super concerning to me in the beginning. He started asking us personal questions like how old we were, what school we went to, where we lived, etc. And I remember starting to feel very odd, like this man wasn't a good man. Right around that time, a group of people gathered around the statue to take selfies with it, and the man turned around and started to yell at them, saying how much he hated human beings and how we all were a curse on the earth. My sister and I free-ached out, and real quickly and quietly, I jabbed my sister in the arm and told her to get her phone out, act like Mom was calling us. He tried talking to us again after he turned around, but we said Mom was calling us, and we had to go and got the fuck out of there. Story 14. I will never forget this. My mom, grandmother, and I were coming out of a Chinese restaurant when I was 13. There was this group of men somewhere outside the restaurant milling around, and they kept glancing at us. We went into a shop in the mall complex adjacent to the restaurant, and one of the men followed us in to make comments to me, my mom, and my grandmother about my looks, and sort of started at me with these googly eyes. He even asked how old I was. Perfectly normal-looking, maybe even attractive man, probably in his 30s, but being an adolescent at the time, everyone looked old and made of me. We just laughed and said thank you. They were even like, wow. Looking back, that was pretty bold and very creepy. Inappropriate of him, and sad they felt it was a compliment. I was obviously 13-ish or so. This was early 90s. Story 15. I was 16, maybe 17, working as a housekeeper at a hotel. Only 3 floors. Top floor is where we keep our carts. I was waiting to go down with my cart when a man in the elevator stopped dead in his tracks staring at me. I asked if he was getting off, and he said no. It was a small elevator, so getting the carts in take maneuvering. Unfortunately, I was squished next to him. He stares at me and asked if he could touch my hair. I didn't know what to say and froze as he touched it. Later, he sees me by the elevator again, and he was going on and on about how I should model. I thanked him and scurried away. Then this MF comes into a room I'm cleaning. Alone. He goes on about what's a guy supposed to do when he sees a beautiful woman. I told him IDK, I'm 16. Either what else he said, but he told me to think about it and left. I had told management about it, and they finally had this spicy little native woman help me. I saw him booking it down the hall straight at me. I ran to the room and bathroom and told her he's coming. She stopped him at the door and let him have it. She told him to fuck off or we're calling the cops. Never saw him again, but Christ, I was so close to being assaulted, I just know it. Story 16. Not as bad as the others on here. Because of my work hours, I tend to get home late from work. I often use the 1-hour drive from work to home as a way to catch up with people. My friend and I had gotten into a conversation that was pretty interesting. I can no longer remember what it was. As a result, when I pulled into my driveway, I did not go immediately inside. Instead, I stayed in my car to finish the conversation. I saw a man standing at the beginning of my driveway, staring straight ahead. There was something off about his face, but I couldn't make out what it was. He then began walking into my driveway. I have relatives that live on the same block as me, so I remember trying to figure out if it was one of them. Then I caught a glimpse of his face. It looked like he had a clown mask on. I immediately just started honking my horn like crazy. It threw him off because he did not realize someone was in the car. He ran away. Turns out my next-door neighbor's wife was having an affair, and that was her lover attempting to kill him. I guess she told her lover we leave our backyard gate unlocked. His plan was to enter our yard, jump over the fence separating our yard from hers, enter their house through a broken window facing their yard, and kill him. He wasn't successful that night, but did make another attempt on the husband's life later that week. I remember that night too. I came home from work and saw the husband staring straight down the street with a worried expression on his face. He didn't even notice me saying hello until the 3rd time I said it, and he told me everything was fine when I asked. An hour later, I heard gunshots. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked the video, like it. Be sure to write comments and share your stories.